Many of us spend our whole life in search of purpose, desperately seeking meaningful ways to make a difference in the world with the short amount of time we are given. The Deploying High podcast has been designed to help you analyze what gives you purpose.
Welcome to the very first episode of Deploying High. I'm Chief Gene Saunders with Project Lifesaver International. As this is our very first episode, I wanted to have somebody that was special to be our very first guest. And it didn't take me long to come up with who I felt would be a very special guest for us. Back when I was a police officer in the late 70s, early 80s, there was a TV show that became almost like a script for law enforcement. When I first tuned into it, my first reaction was, wow, they've nailed it. They hit it right on the head about the life, especially of a detective, and some of the quirks and catches that you run into during the course of your job. That show was Barney Miller. And this gentleman had a very big role in that show. He started out as Detective Wojciechowicz, and later got promoted to sergeant. And he's had many, many, many other roles during his career. I would like to, at a later point, tell you more about him and get him to tell you more about himself. But right now, we're going to hear a few words from Project Lifesaver.
Squad 57.
You see it in the news. Patients with Alzheimer's or young children with autism wander off from their caregivers and become lost. After 24 hours, there's only a 50% survival rate. Searches can involve multiple agencies, hundreds of officers and volunteers, and thousands of dollars. Since 1999, Project Lifesaver International has provided first responders and caregivers with technology and training to quickly locate individuals with cognitive disorders who are prone to wander. The method relies on proven radio technology, together with specially trained search and rescue teams. The result? A 100% program success rate with over 3,600 lives saved so far. Instead of hours or days lost, the average recovery time is 30 minutes. To learn more, visit projectlifesaver.org.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Deploying High podcast, bringing it all into view.
Welcome back. I'm Chief Gene Saunders with Project Lifesaver International, and this is Deploying High. Well, if you haven't already guessed who my guest is, you have been living in a bubble for a very long time. He's a very special gentleman. I first had the occasion to meet and talk with him in 2019. When we reached out on the urging of my wife to get him to speak at our conference, because at that time he was playing a role in a popular soap opera, General Hospital, of Mike Corbin, a person that was suffering with Alzheimer's. So I took her advice and we reached out. I was extremely surprised to find out in talking to this gentleman how cordial and gentlemanly he was. He was down to earth and very courteous. Nothing like what I thought a celebrity would be. And when we asked him to speak, he came with no problem. And then I asked one more favor of him. Would you become an ambassador for Project Lifesaver? He didn't flinch. He took it right on and has performed admirably ever since. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very proud to introduce as our first guest and a very special guest, Mr. Max Gail. Hello, Max.
Hey, Gene, how you doing?
I'm doing good, sir. How are you?
Good.
Good. So, in getting into some of your background, and I would like for you to expound on it, I was very surprised.
Gene, before we do that, just in response to that beautiful introduction, okay. I want to say that it was so welcome to because playing that role, I had done a play once with a character who was suffering from Alzheimer's, and then I was playing this part. I thought the writing was great. All of the other actors, it changed my my own personal notion of soap operas, but in particular, it connected me with so many people on the set, with the crew and other actors, and in life that were dealing with Alzheimer's. And so finding out about Project Lifesaver, and then a chance to be involved was really welcome to me. And all those good things you said about me, I found true with you and everyone else I met there. So then go ahead. But I just
Thank
wanted
you,
to get
Max.
that out.
You're very generous, very generous. But as I told you earlier, I did a little dive into your career, and I was surprised. I shouldn't have been, but I was surprised to find out that you've got 2 degrees. You have a bachelor's in economics and a master's in international economics. And I would bet very few people really know that. So my question to you is, what happened from economics to acting?
Well, as you know, and I'm sure all the people listening, whatever our job title or our particular thing we're involved in at any one time is only a part of us. So I grew up in a family where there was a lot of music. My mother had been an actress in theater before she got married at a pretty young age and proceeded to have 7 kids in 6 years. She had 3 sets of twins. So she had 5. I was 3 years old. I was the oldest of 5. And then the last set of twins came along a couple of years later. So, but she stayed active in the local theater. My dad had been a piano player and a band leader, and then along with his office supply store, he booked a lot of bands in Detroit. So it wasn't such a stretch. I got through college and graduate school playing piano bars and pickup rock bands. I was more my sister and my brother that were into the acting, but the time came where an opportunity arose when I had moved out to San Francisco. And I had finished my was an MBA I got. That was the Vietnam era, and divided a lot of people. It was an opportunity or an option that I had because of a certain actually an element of privilege involved with it. But I had that I could go to graduate school and not go to Vietnam. And, it was really in my early 30s, I was up late one night talking with my mom, and she said something, and I don't remember what it was she said. I just remember it became totally clear to me that she had instilled in my brother and I, don't go to war. And the reason for that was that my wonderful grandpa Jack was a World War II psychological casualty, what these days we would call PTSD. And so he had a rugged after-war life of drinking and other things that, by the time I knew him, he was a sweet old wonderful grandfather. But that was that informed my decisions. And when a chance came up to do something other than join the military, that's what I did. And so I wasn't so fascinated with. I was more of a science geek that probably would have gone into engineering and stuff, except that I just wasn't that good at the math. So I arced over into economics. So still, it was, I was in San Francisco. I was thinking of going to law school because school was something that always came pretty easy to me. And I could play a piano bar gig from 5 to 9 at the Hyatt House and make enough money to live at that time. And I took the law boards, but that right around that same time, a play had opened up based on a novel that I'd written, read, that was a popular at that time called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Remember,
and it was one of those stories. There have been other movies and other stories made that kind of said, the real crazies are out in the world. It was kind of that sort of a flip look at what was going on in what was somewhat of a mad world in those times, as in these. And so it happened that this play had opened, and I knew about it. And then one of the they got a good review, so they had to look for understudies. And I happened to see the little ad they put out, and just on a whim, I went down and read for one of the parts, and they offered me another one as an understudy. And before I could even rehearse it, the guy who was playing that part got fired because he had an artistic difference with one of the other actors. But he was a big weightlifter, strong type, and the other actor was more of a drinking straw. And the rest of the cast said, "We can't have this." So suddenly I was playing the part of the character in the novel and in the play, and in subsequently the movie, Chief Bromden. And that's what got me started. I found something, in that, exploring that part and that time, and I just kept with it. What I think of is not so much of a career as a careen, kind of going from one situation to another. But I know you've gone from, you've had a very interesting career yourself. Always looking to grow, though. And I guess I'll cap off this little riff with, over the years, it's I've had a lot of young people ask me, what for advice. And I always say, if you think that the whatever your idea of fame and fortune, and you think that some kind of fame and fortune might make you happy and work for you, there will never be enough. But if you use it as an opportunity to keep growing as a person, and trying to be of service in some kind of way, then it will always work for you, whatever your acting career turns out to be. And I think that's where there's an overlap with many fields, but certainly with police work and public, that kind of public service.
Well, now that you've mentioned police work, let's talk about your role as Wojciechowicz. Mm-hmm. How did you get into that? And then tell us about it.
Well, I had, at that time, I had made it. I decided, when I finished with the play, and I came down to Los Angeles, I thought I'm going to follow this route a little bit. I ended up going into a New York production of the play for a year, and then came back. And I was mainly, the kind of guy that would get cast as the sort of one of the bad guys, or the second or third level bad guys in a TV series. I was, fairly healthy and hunky, and those are the kind of parts I'd get. I got a call from my agent that I'd been called in by a casting director for a show. He says, and I remember he said, "It's a police show, because if you could get, a regular on a show, well, then you'd be a good guy." So the temporary parts were mostly bad guys. And he said, "I don't know, it's a comedy." Like, that might be, it just kind of showed me more about how he saw me. And then I did. But I went in and I read for Danny Arnold, who was the creator of Barney Miller, and a wonderful, big, broad-shouldered, big, thick, curly, red-haired, beautifully laugh-lined face, and just a great writing talent and comic talent. And I read from the first thing he said to me was, I had this, we did this pilot once, it didn't get picked up, I'm doing it again. I had a wonderful actor in this part, Charlie Haig, who a lot of people would know from Hill Street Blues, which came after, but Charlie was committed to directing a play in New York. And he said, I have to tell you, you're really not liking him at all, but if you want to go ahead and read. And I love that candor. And I read, and he said, "You showed me there's a different way to do it." Because originally the character was named Kaczynski, and he was the idea was he was someone who really thought in black and white terms, and we all know people like that. But I was, I guess, drawn more to where's the heart in this guy. And the pilot got picked up, and I started doing it, and it was a wonderful experience with a lot of people, way more experience than I. Most of them, I can't think of one that I wouldn't say was more talented as well, but I hung in there with just trying to do my best. And I think that Danny's one of his great aspects of his talent was that he would find in the characters an aspect of himself, and then an aspect of that character and of that actor. So we were not so much making fun of others as finding humor within our own inner processes. And as my friend Wavy Gravy says, when you lose your sense of humor, it's just not funny anymore. So it was a great experience of life to be in something that I think we really tried to deal with issues that are place issues. It was often said by Danny and other writers that sometimes they'd get plot ideas from actual police that were so outlandish that they said, if we write this, it'll be too much.
No, I would say, yeah, it can get very outlandish at times. And, you had a wonderful ensemble on that show, and it was true to life. And to my opinion, not because I'm talking to you right now, but just in my opinion, your character actually stood out in many ways because it impressed me as being the young, impressionable cop that was trying to do a good job and see it in another way. And that just kind of brought it home to me many times. Maybe I took something from it. I'm not sure. But let me do this. Ladies and gentlemen, you're listening to Deploying High with Chief Gene Saunders as your host. And our special guest is Max Gail. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and our podcast channel and come see us. We'll have more special guests, but right now, Max Gail. So when you were doing Barney Miller, you received an Emmy for that role. Am I correct?
No, I got nominated twice, but I lost out.
But you have received two Emmys.
I did on the General Hospital.
Both of them were for General Hospital?
Yes.
Well, let's talk about General Hospital then, since, that topic is now up. My wife was an ardent viewer of General Hospital. And she called me one day and she said, listen, they've got a role and it's of an Alzheimer's patient. Well, that piqued my interest. And I said, well, I guess I need to kind of look at it. So I came home one day and she had it on, and lo and behold, who was playing that part? Max Gail. First thing I said was, wow, Wojciech. Now, I know that is kind of painting you into a corner with one character, and that's not true because you have played in many, many roles. One I'd like to just kind of highlight, you played in the movie 42.
Mm-hmm.
Correct? You played a coach. So how was that role?
Well, that was a great experience. I played the manager who was called in after the manager at the time was fired. That was a great project because it's such a wonderful story, and it's the kind of film that usually is made by a small independent film of a lot of earnest people. But but this was a big budget film, and it had all A-list of performers and crew and all, and yet it had that feeling of everybody really wanting to tell this story. And so it was just it was great to be a part of it. And the character I played, I found a fellow who's a Christian minister, but he was a baseball coach, and he had written a book on the character I played, because it was all based on the history. And he wrote a wonderful book about this character and his relationship with Branch Rickey, who was Harrison Ford played the part of the manager, or of the team that made that decision to go ahead and bring a black player. Maybe a lot of people don't know, but the Negro leagues at the time were as good as the major leagues. It's just that we were still stuck in a place where segregation was, kept the players apart. And so, it was a great experience.
Well, it was a great movie. Before, I'd like to just retrogress a little bit before we get into Mike Corbin. You've done a lot of advocacy work that I think a lot of people may not know about, and I'd like for you to discuss and bring to the forefront. Tell us about some of your advocacy work.
Okay. Well, one of the things that really hit me like a big storm coming up or something like that. But as once the show got on the air, in those days there were like 3 channels and PBS, right? There were 3 networks and PBS. So if you were on prime time, suddenly there was this whole thing churning around the fame part and TV guide interviews and so on and so forth. And in many ways, people just wanted to tell the sort of the same story. Another young actor, finds the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. That, it was just a strange experience for me. I wasn't unused to being, in the public eye in a way, because growing up in a family with 3 sets of twins, it was common for the people to do stories on our family. So I was used to that, and also used to, well, that's the story they told, and I know the real story behind the scenes, But I just had not given thought to it, and I wasn't prepared for a lot of just that feeling. And there were opportunities to do telethons. In some way you wanted to try to balance that out and stuff. But while I had been playing the part of the chief in Cuckoo's Nest in San Francisco, and then later in New York, there were things happening in the Native American world, in Indian country, as they say. There was a time of a reassertion of sovereignty rights, is the way they said it, but saying, wait a minute, we have these treaties. It's written in the Constitution. They're the law of the land. They were treaties that the nation of the United States made with other nations, and yet they'd been kind of pushed aside, abrogated, disrespected. And there was an effort made on a lot of levels, some of them quite visible, but to change that. And so I had started writing songs somewhere in there during those years of acting. I reached the point I thought, well, maybe this is what the acting part was about, of getting me to creating my own songs that were more about my own inner experience of life and growth and spiritual development and all of that. And so it turned out that a friend of mine was working with a native artist that many people our age might remember, Buffy St. Marie. Buffy, at the time, it was sort of Bob Dylan and Joan Baez and Buffy St. Marie. And Buffy's message about what, from a Native American point of view, got her pretty much blacklisted on the radio. But by that time, she was on Sesame Street with her new baby and her husband, Sheldon Wolfchild. And they were part of the Sesame Street. And Buffy was looking to put together a tour to Australia. And anyway, it ended up that she reached out and said, would you like to be an opening act? Because they were starting to show Barney Miller there. And she related to some of the songs, I guess. And anyway, I went up to talk to her at a recording studio in San Francisco. And I met a bunch of the Indian people who were I'd been aware of as part of that movement. And that connected me on a whole bunch of levels to life. But one of them was, here's something that I really feel like I can get behind and somehow use this attention I'm getting to reflect that attention, or connect it to something that was really important. And that got me started. One of the things I learned was it's not that easy. It's not that easy to get a message across because people have their own ideas. That's why it's wonderful we can have podcasts and you can really tell the story of Project Lifesaver, without having to work so much through just more directly. Although I think you guys have done a marvelous job of doing that, of telling the story, and it's a great story. But anyway, that's what got me to being in those days we like the idea of actor activist. In some ways, you can be feel like I love what I'm doing, and I'm glad that people like it. But it's a little silly how much attention it gets, and especially when that comes with such an idea of what it's all about. That's in a way, acting is more about taking the mask off than putting it on, and about connecting to the human condition. So the idea that you get raised up into some sort of kind of idea of celebrity, is a little confusing. I think that's why some people seem to react to it so badly. In many ways, there's another role you're supposed to play. This is how a soap opera star is supposed to act,
Well, you
but I
certainly
think
don't.
again that I want to say I think that affects people in all fields. It's not unique to actors. It's just a little more amplified.
Yeah, I agree. Well, as I said, you certainly don't fit that mold. And I'm here to tell anybody that does not know you or has not met you about how cordial and I liked it because you're so down to earth and easy to talk to and very willing to do whatever it needs to be done to take care of a task or get the message across. So, all right, now let's go into Mike Corbin. Mike Corbin is the father of a gangster,
Mm-hmm.
and he has Alzheimer's. So how did all of that come into play?
Okay, well, the character of Mike Corbin had been played by another actor for some time, but he had retired, I think it was like 7 years before they brought him back. And I'm blanking on his name. I'm having what my son calls sometimers, or I would say it, but I mean, it was a popular character, but his backstory was that he'd been pretty much a washout as a dad. He was a gambling addict, and the relationship was that he would often get himself in trouble by going for the big win. And his son, the gangster, would have to bail him out. But the dad was not a gangster, and there was that dynamic. And the son was, Mike had kind of disappeared from his life other than to show up and disappoint him every once in a while as a child. But the mother had married a cop who had a serious anger management problems and eventually, beat her to death or something like that. It's a soap, but it happens. And so there was this really negative history. But what they came up with in wanting to do an Alzheimer's story, they came up with that while he'd been away, while the dad had been away, he'd gotten into Gamblers Anonymous. So he'd worked out, had his 12-step program. A lot of people know Alcoholics Anonymous, and I would say some might describe Gamblers Anonymous as a little bit more secular. You know, there are always these issues of the higher power and whether you can, buy into that or not, which is, of course, an obvious no problem for many people, but a big issue for other people. But nonetheless, 12-step programs do help people if they work it. They say it works if you work it. If they work it, it helps them to understand why they keep making bad decisions in their life that end up hurting them and often the people they love and sometimes total strangers. But anyway, I thought that was a great backstory. And so he'd kind of gotten it together, except he was losing his memory. So this is how they brought him back into the picture. He was doing, running errands for gangster people, and he didn't show up with some money at some point, and one of those guys called Mike's son, Sonny, and said, "Hey, your dad's disappeared with some money, and maybe you better figure out what's going before we do something about it." And so what it did, and one thing was it, underlying this, Maurice is kind of the star of the show. If there is a star of the show, there are so many characters and it's also collaborative, but we have this fascination with both sides of the law. We tell those stories from both points of view. You have the Sopranos and you have, so at any rate, that was an underlying aspect of, well, who is Mike? I'm coming in to play this character. The character's been there before, but now I'm a new actor coming in and playing it. So I relied a lot on that kind of 12-step awareness. He was in a relationship, but when it turned out that he had, they found out he had Alzheimer's, the gal he was in a relationship with said, I know enough to know that I'm not able to deal with it. So they managed to get Mike Corbin back into Sonny's family with no one else around, and then to deal with this, at first denial of his memory issues, and then really clarification that he really did have Alzheimer's, and then looking forward, the fear of what is that going to be like. And I found that, it was really wonderful stuff to play as an actor because it's so human. And I got reinforcement for how I was doing from people on the set. Jimmy, the sound guy, said, "God, you're just like my grandpa." He'd gone, in high school, his grandpa was in the household. Just a lot of people, that would share what this experience is like. And I think the writers did a great job. And the image of soap opera actors is, very drama queen kind of thing, but there's very little of that. People are very supportive of each other. It's challenging. They move really fast. They don't do a lot of takes. You gotta deliver. Does that help answer that question?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. In fact, if I read this correctly, now I didn't see this episode, but you actually got to go back to your singing roots in General Hospital. So tell us about that.
Okay, well, that's, it's, as I, continue to research and stuff, and one of the things that's well known is that music is something people will stay connected with. And sometimes people who have not been able to make contact with anybody, and suddenly, if there's a song gets played and they know all the words, or they'll sit down at the piano and start playing, and there is something about music that I think we all know that music really, touches the heart. And so I had gone to our showrunner, Frank, and asked him, I said, what are you guys thinking about? Well, one thing I asked him, when does this end? Because it was going on longer than they had first projected. They first said it'd be a couple of months, and it was long past that. I think in a way they do that so that if it isn't working out, they can save face. Everybody can save face and say, well, that was all we expected to do. And I said, so I'd love to know, where it's going. And in particular, what are you doing about music? And he said, why do you sing? You want to do something? Because we have the nurses' ball coming up. Well, in General Hospital, I didn't know this, but the nurses' ball was started some years ago as a way to actually deal with AIDS within the story. A lot of people don't know that and I didn't. The soaps were first to deal with AIDS, the first to deal with interracial relationships. They actually have a pretty good history, even though they're seen by people who aren't soap fans as being, kind of lightweight. But they actually have a very good history of dealing with issues that affect people. And so I said, but I didn't know really what the nurses' ball was. But he said, do you sing? I say, well, if you said, can I sing? I'd say that's up to, but I do, because I write songs. It's a way of helping me understand where I'm going. And he said, we could do something with the nurses' ball. And I said, well, I don't know that my songs would be Mike's songs. It seems like he would be more likely to do, he said, like Frank Sinatra, he suggested. And I said, yeah. And I said, so I hope my answers aren't too long to your questions, but
no, just go for it.
So anyway, it turns out one of the songs I had written early on, and in the early days of Barney Miller, they had the whole cast on the Dinah Shore show. Some of the people our age might remember the Dinah Shore show. That was long before The View and those kinds of things. She had a wonderful afternoon kind of variety talk show. And they had the whole cast on, and they had us each, do something. And I ended up doing a song, a poem and a song. And the song, I'd gotten a letter from one letter. I got a lot of response in the poem, but the song, I got one response. And it was from a man named Gordon Jenkins, who I found out later had been the kind of Quincy Jones of his era. He was a composer and arranger for Frank Sinatra and Tony Bennett and Judy Garland. And he was a really highly respected. The last album he did with Sinatra, the big hit that came off that album was When I Was 17, It Was a Very Good Year.
One of my favorites.
These wonderful violin, orchestral da 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 da. That was all classic Gordon Jenkins. And he wrote me a letter and said, your song, it's called "We're Going to the Ocean By and By." It was he said, your song stood out like a laughing pallbearer. I wonder if you'd be willing to come by my home. I'd love to record that. And I ended up doing that. He was very gracious, kind of like Jimmy Stewart type personality, and he said, I would like to, I said, you got any others? And he recorded a bunch of my songs. And he said, I'd like to send this to Mr. Sinatra. I have to wait a little bit because his mother just died in a small plane crash. But I would like to do that. And I said, well, okay, we'll talk. For me at that time, Sinatra was a Nixon supporter. He was a Kennedy supporter, but Kennedy stood him up. He was, Sinatra was all excited to have Kennedy visit him. And Kennedy's brother said, you're in a relationship with the gal who's also in a relationship with a big crime boss in Chicago. You can't go visit Sinatra. So he canceled and landed his helicopter instead of at Sinatra's. He landed at a golf course and went over, had a big high profile visit with Bing Crosby. So Sinatra was not happy about that. Yeah. There was all that history. But I had never followed up on that. I got more, it was time that I connected with Buffy, as I was talking about before. And my music took me in a whole other direction. And so I told him, well, here's the song that, because a Sinatra song would be very expensive. I said, I think if Mike's going to do a song, but anyway, we parlayed around that, the song, and eventually they decided, I guess, to pop for the money. And they said, we want to have Mike. The idea was at the nurses' ball, there's always something that happens. Every year, something happens. And in this case, somebody got arrested on stage, one of the other characters. And Mike gets up on the mic and says, well, my name is Mike Corbin. He's kind of stepped into his 12-step. I'm, a lot of you may know me. I might not remember you. I have Alzheimer's. But the show must go on. And that was the idea. And he lapses into The Summer Wind, which is one of my favorite songs of that era. And he sings the first verse, and it kind of goes okay. And then they kicked into like what is happening for him. And suddenly there's a Sinatra hat on the stool, and he puts that on, and suddenly behind him is a big 12-piece orchestra and lights. And, he gets through the second verse like it's really happening, in his imagination. And it gets into the third verse, and at a certain point, he just freezes and can't go on. And so everybody's just looking at this guy, and the music stops, the piano player stops, the band is not there anymore. And his son, Sonny, the big mafioso guy in the imaginary town, city that they all live in, but who is still gets his respect. It's just a strange balance there. And but he comes up. He's never gone on stage before. He doesn't do that. He comes up and helps his dad finish the song. So it ended up being a beautiful little scene, and it was a lot of fun to do. And I thought I better get some help on this. I talked to a friend of mine who was a voice coach I knew, and she said, well, let's see, I'll play it here and you sing it, and we'll see where we are. And I sang a little bit, and she said, okay, let's start at the beginning. And she gave me some instructions on how to breathe and from the diaphragm, the most basic, because I really never had enough confidence in my voice to actually work on it. I love to get a group of people singing so I could sing loud, but anyway, that's what that was. It was a fun
You're
day.
listening to Deploying High. I'm your host, Gene Saunders, the Chief Executive Officer with Project Lifesaver International. Please join us again on our podcast channel or our YouTube channel. Now, I'm talking with our special guest, Max Gail, and I'd like to close it out, Max, with one more question. What's next?
Well, something I hope, because my appetite is maybe stronger than ever. I had a period in my life where I dropped out just to deal with family issues. I had became a single widower, and stuff. But, what I'd like to say, what's next as far as this, is that I was hoping we would talk more about Project Lifesaver. So I'd like to close by saying that the sense of community around the organization, the ongoing number of lives that have been saved, by finding people quickly rather than after 2 or 3 expensive weeks of searching and often a tragic outcome. And it's a continually growing. There are still many, many communities. I've been very impressed with how you have reached out into the Native American community, because it's, very personal to me in that way. But I just like to say is, my contribution to this podcast, that anybody who's listening, if there's a way to, find out, maybe you can help people with this. Does this exist? Is it because it's a relationship with the law enforcement agency there in your community, and then other people have to know about it. But it reaches a wide group of people who might wander with autism or Alzheimer's or other issues, and people that those individuals are not in a home that already has their own wristbands or whatever, their own security, and can collaborate with any of those situations. And it's just a really wonderful use of technology and human hearts to avoid tragic outcomes. And so if you're motivated, if you have someone in your family that's, so you're dealing with this, you might want to get that support in your community. I'm sure that you, Gene, will find a way to help people get that message. But that's what I would like to leave this podcast with, is just a big advocacy for Project Lifesaver.
Max, thank you so much. You've been a great guest. And certainly in the future, you can count on me asking you to come back. Thank you again. You have been listening to Deploying High. I am Chief Gene Saunders. Please join us again on our next podcast. And as this is being aired on Veterans Day, I would like to send out a special thank you to all my fellow veterans who have served, and to Captain Ron Yaw. We miss you, and we know and are celebrating your birthday. Thank you, and have a great day.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Deploying High podcast with Chief Gene Saunders, brought to you by Project Lifesaver International. Deploying High would like to thank all of our supporters across the country and around the world. If you'd like to help support the podcast, please subscribe to our channel, make a donation, and don't forget to tell a friend about us. All proceeds from the Deploying High podcast go to support Project Lifesaver International, online at projectlifesaver.org, the original 501c3 nonprofit organization.